So I actually prepared this with Lavanya Ramakrishnan, who's our deputy division director now in the scientific data division. And both of us have done a lot of work with user interfaces and user experience. And so I wanted to talk about how I think that can be incorporated with the good things that everyone does here. Um, so as soon as I figure out how to advance the slide, there we go. So I wanted to start by saying that I'll just make the statement now, and hopefully this, if you don't believe it, it gets a little bit proven as I go along. But user interfaces are important for research software in general, um, and for some of the same reasons, really, that user interfaces are important for software that's not research software. They make complex tasks simpler or possible and provide visualizations and visual controls that encourage experimentation. I would say that more on the research software side, they enable understanding of groups and communities that are outside the researcher's experience and become a bridge to broader applications of the research results, which is, I'll note, a function that's not typically served by academic publications, which tend to be more targeted at people who already understand exactly, the details of the research results. And when I say user interfaces, by the way, most of what I'm going to show is graphical, but really it could apply to graphical or application programming interfaces, command line interfaces, or something else. So the kind of commonality is that in the research domain, I think designing user interfaces is really designing for expert use. And that's kind of probably the key difference that you'll see across a lot of these projects with things that you see in commercial applications. So before diving in a little further, I'd like to kind of define like what I mean by UI and UX roles. And before doing that, I'll also say that I know that a lot of user interface development is kind of not done by people who would say that's what I do all the time. It's kind of it's development as part of I have to do this in order to get my work done or do something else that I meant to do already. It's kind of accidental. People are thrown into it. And guess I can relate. The very first thing I did at Berkeley Lab myself, but way back when, we used two sticks and rubbed them together to make fire, was when I was first an intern at the lab. That I showed up kind of day one, and they sat me in front of my giant CRT screen and said, "Hey, we've got a user interface here that the previous intern kind of left half done. Can you finish it? And here's a Tickle TK app, and by the way, we hate the color scheme. Can you fix that as well?" And that was my introduction to being a user interface developer. So I think that kind of accidental experience is, if not in detail, but in some aspect, common across a lot of people. But there are also a lot of people who define themselves by doing a lot of particular UI and UX roles. And that's true in my group and a lot of other groups, I think, at the labs. And there are different kinds of UI and UX roles. And I'm going to kind of give them in the order, I would say, of the order in which they kind of occur in the development of a project. So the user researcher is someone who goes out and takes initial ideas and prototypes and talks to users. That's what the performing user research really means, or solicits feedback through things like surveys to sort of understand what the problem space really is. Then there's user experience designers who will design the workflow of the application, get feedback on working versions, and to fix design problems and get ideas for how the features work. Then graphical designers, this is a role that's often subsumed, as part of another one that people have, was rarely something you have at the national labs as a sole description. But graphical designer will create the look and feel of the user interface. So do things like choosing colors, fonts, graphics, making layout decisions. And then finally, the user interface developer is the role that would write the JavaScript or HTML and create documentation, deploy the software. And of course, these are kind of hats, really, that sometimes are worn. One person may wear many of these hats. Some people may wear one primarily. But it's important to kind of understand that there are different roles involved in the creation of the user interfaces and understanding how to make good user interfaces. So I want to walk through a couple examples to sort of ground this discussion a bit, and starting with the point that in our work we have really come to the point where we take a kind of a dual approach to scientific and engineering software, which is at Berkeley Lab what I would describe as what we do, and that we take user research, which looks sort of sits at the center between the users and the R&D team. And we use that as a process to validate the intuition about what the user needs and convert that into action. So, sort of the user experience designer essentially becomes the center of those two circles between understanding the science needs and actually implementing all the system software and tools on the back end. So I'll give a couple of examples of some projects I've been in and why this has convinced me that user interfaces are really important. So the first one is the materials project. This is a pretty popular in the materials science community, web-based and also other API-based interface for getting at state-of-the-art computations for materials, particularly bulk solids, but I believe they have some more in there now as well. Metal organic frameworks, et cetera. And really, the genesis of the project was to make these state-of-the-art computations available to the broader community. So it was a little unusual in that in the material science community that from the very beginning, they emphasized user interface because they knew getting to experimentalists and people outside their domain of theory was going to require something that was more friendly. And the UI was really essential for making this data visible and accessible. So I was a small part of this project, but I think I'm not going to take a lot of credit for the kind of the immense success that it's had. I think I just showed this bottom graph to show how well this particular website has succeeded. That number there, this is a chart of the users per month over time, and that number is 100,000. So that's a fair number of users for a material science application in particular that are really getting some use out of this user interface. Another example I'll give is one where you can see that the user experience approach has really been useful in revealing underlying workflows. And this happened some time ago on a project called the Nearby Supernova Factory, or SN Factory, where they had an interface to their data. And it was kind of a search interface that they had to the data system. And the user experience expert went in and talked to them and tried to understand their problem. And what they found was that they had a bunch of notebooks that they were using on the side to actually track what was going on with all these supernova, discoveries that the system was finding, that they weren't using, that the system wasn't actually helping them with at all. And what they need, so they had a search interface, but what they really needed was a tracking system that took the place of and improved what they were actually doing on the side with their notebooks. So it's that kind of insight that you really get from starting with the user experience view of this. And then finally, I'll talk about, there's a recent project we have called Pareto, which stands for, well, it's not too important what it stands for. The important part is that it's bringing the power of mathematical optimization to a domain. It's called produced water. And for those of you who've never heard that phrase, like I hadn't, that means basically water that comes out of things like the oil and gas industry that's not potable, but could be processed to be used in other ways instead of just dumped back down into a hole in the ground. Which is actually, and I won't go into it, but is actually a major problem. So in this case, the main point is that UI and UX are a really important bridge between the researchers who have these optimization models that are able to come up with better solutions and the actual community that needs to implement it, because those people are not, the end users don't know anything about optimization models. They know a lot about how their system works, but not about how the model works. And there needs to be a bridge between the two. And that's where UI and UX can figure out what that bridge should be, understand how the users want to use the software. And in this project, for example, the software to some extent is ready to roll, but they can't really release it until the user interface is at the point where users can use it, because that's the only way they're really going to be able to understand how to work with this code. So those are some examples, some projects that UI and UX was sort of featured on. We've also doing some research on user interfaces and user experience. So in our research environment, because having worked on a number of these projects, you begin to see similarities across the science domains and the science applications, and you wonder if there's something better we can do to make this process of designing these workflows more consistent, more efficient, and et cetera. And so this is a research project that's recently been funded from the Sloan Foundation, where we're going to be asking these questions about if we can have a typology that can characterize better in a more abstract way than just anecdotally all the different things that are going into these different workflows, and can we come up with a design system or a design framework that can simplify the design of these user interfaces and make it easier for things to be more intuitive for the users. So there is some research to be done as well, and RSEs would play a role, both on both sides of the fence there. So I've gone pretty quickly because I kind of wanted to get to this main slide. This is sort of the end game in my presentation. And hopefully there's a few questions and comments people have that we can spend time on after I'm done here. But it's because I think that right now, the user experience and user interface perspective is a little bit less visible than it could be. And I think that actually making it more visible and more prominent and including more people from those sides of the community will help improve the diversity and inclusion across the board, because I think user experience and user research tends to ask the right questions, which is what do people, in this case users, really need, and what people or practices are we not addressing? It's questions like that that we need to be asking to keep building the community as well. And of course, it's not a coincidence because you're trying to build a community to use the software, right? So it's some of the same goals, just in a different context. And so I think those are kind of the right skill sets and the right experience sets to be including to help expand the RSE community. And so if you accept that, if we have that in mind, I would say that we have an opportunity to kind of do a few things to include UX and UI more fully in the community. One would be to examine some current definitions that we tend to have out there of RSEs with a bit of a critical eye. Even though this seems like a very minor thing, I think these do matter, and that when you see wording or descriptions of something that you don't feel includes you, there's less of a tendency for you to say, well, I want to be part of this, right? So when we have definitions that sort of exclusively focus on expertise in programming for the definition of an RSE, I think that's a little bit exclusive, not just of UI and UX, by the way, but of probably some other groups. So we should keep an eye on that. But also sort of more constructive forward things to do would be looking for more representation opportunities for UX and UI. For instance, topics at meetings and workshops, case studies that get documented on web pages, considerations when you talk about RSE and careers and impact. Think, we're including anyone who's doing user interfaces or user research. We could probably start a channel, and then this is something that anyone could do. So it's on me as much as anyone to start a channel in US RSE Slack, or include a working group that's somewhat specific to user research and user interfaces in the US RSE organization. And the other thing that comes to mind that I'd like to mention at this point, there might be some other groups that might also be on the margins that we're not thinking about as much as we should. So what come off the top of my head more or less was that DevOps, people who work on documentation. I actually have one person in my group who describes themselves as a documentarian. So there are people who do enough documentation that's a major part of their job, and there's actually, of course, an industry that's a job description. And then user support, right? People who kind of exclusively interact with users, and to some extent, even some of the manager level people could describe themselves this way. Are other people that might be somewhat on the margins, and again, if you look back at that sort of straw man definition, not quite as well covered by that. So that's my talk. That's my overview. I just ready. I don't know if I gave myself, did. Thank you. And I always try to end early on talks. So I would be happy to take any questions. I see there's something in the chat which I wasn't able to. Oh, is there time for questions?
Yeah, there's definitely time for questions, Dan. Feel free to raise your hand and unmute or enter your question in the chat. We'll be happy to field them.
Okay, will you call on people or should I?
Go ahead, Ian. I think Ian has his hand first.
Hey, thanks, Dan. I kind of want to maybe echo or endorse. I've seen in my group a lot more request for this type of making my research accessible through some kind of, interface or website or, some way more than a command line or a downloadable package. So I think, and I've seen this uptick in like the last couple years really taking off. So I think you're right to kind of bring attention to it. And so maybe this is less of a question, more of a, USRC is a great place to do this. And we're trying to talk about these ideas of affinity groups. So people who work on similar type things of getting together and building a sub community. So rather than a working group where you're trying to produce something, an affinity group where you get together and discuss issues that you're seeing, that you're interacting with, that you're, tools, technologies, tips, tricks, and building a sub community. So because I think it is a growing subgroup. So I guess that's just a big endorsement rather than a question.
I think that's a great idea. Affinity groups. That's a much better way to put it. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Go ahead, Aaron. You're next.
Cool. Hey, thanks for the talk. That was pretty cool. So I'm just kind of curious at a really high level. One of the things that I do here is try to take industry ideas and apply them to RSE work. So I'm a big proponent of domain-driven design, for example, sit down with clients and figure out like their exact domains and use cases and whatnot and kind of go from there. But I'm curious what sort of techniques and methodologies you apply to the design of APIs and UI, UX, and so on and so forth.
I think we try to emulate some of the things that are done in industry, which is so what I think is most effective is talking with domain experts to start with to get it. You have to get some background before you can start going out and talking with people. Otherwise, you seem like you're asking questions that are so far off the beaten track. But then with some background in hand, having something that people can look at, like a prototype or anything. It could actually, I've done it with pieces of paper with sketches on them. They need something to look at before they believe you. And it can't be so good that they believe it's already implemented. And then talking with people in very small groups, 1 or 2 researchers with 1 person, and walking through what do you actually do to get your job done. I think that may be exactly what you're describing, by the way, is probably the primary method of prioritizing and understanding work processes, because I find that in a larger group, people are often reluctant to talk about things that they consider one-off or backwards ways that they do things, but that are actually the real way that they do things, right? And so it has to be a smaller group. So that's one of the tricks, and of course, looking for diversity of people that you talk to is always really important.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, one thing that we're about to try, you're definitely right that some people are reluctant to speak up in larger groups. So we're going to try event storming, where people don't really talk, but they put their ideas down on Post-its and we kind of reorganize things. And yeah, it definitely seems like a pretty cool and useful idea, but we'll see how that works out.
That'll be, I'd love to hear about that. Yeah. I mean, I found a lot of the best insights have actually come from things we didn't ask, but things that people, after they got a little comfortable, would just we didn't script it. It just, oh, by the way, it's like, oh, that by the way was something that was more important than any question I had. So, yeah.
Thanks, appreciate the input.
Thank you.